thank you all for coming back from lunch, resisting the temptation to take a nap. I know how after lunch there's that temptation. So in the 45 minutes we have this afternoon, I want to go through 4 arguments against physician-assisted suicide. Why not? And this is based upon a long research paper that I wrote for the Heritage Foundation titled Always Care, Never Kill: How Physician-Assisted Suicide Endangers the Weak, Corrupts Medicine, Compromises the Family, and Violates Human Dignity. Because as the earlier presentation this morning mentioned, right now only 3 of the 50 states have authorized physician-assisted suicide. None of the states have euthanasia, and only 3 have assisted suicide. We're going through a debate right now. There are over 20-some, I forget the exact number now, but 20-some states have bills that have already been introduced this year to legalize physician-assisted suicide. And so far, all of those bills have been defeated. California has had their bill come up and be sidelined, and now it's come up again, and it's been sidelined again, and it keeps going up in that cyclical fashion. But other states, Maryland, right next door to where I live in DC, several New England states, 3 years ago, Massachusetts voted against physician-assisted suicide. So places that are rather liberal, you don't think of California or Massachusetts as being bastions of conservatism. They've defeated these bills precisely for the reasons that were mentioned this morning. There's a broad coalition opposed, and I want to highlight 4 of those arguments. Because the Hippocratic Oath, 2,500 years ago, again from ancient Greece, got it right. Hippocratic Oath is which medical professionals would swear. I will keep them from harm and injustice. I will neither give a deadly drug to anyone who asked for it, nor will I make a suggestion to this effect. That was the oath that physicians swore 2.5 millennia ago and right up through today, precisely because they experienced the temptation to prescribe that deadly drug. So it's not a new temptation. This has been around since the beginning of medicine. And having that bright line marker that physicians are always to care and never to kill was essential to Greek society, just as it's been essential to our society. No one, especially a doctor, should be permitted to kill or to assist in killing. And now, as was mentioned this morning, this doesn't mean human life needs to be extended by every medical means possible, but it does mean that an innocent person should never be killed. Doctors can help their patients die a dignified death of natural causes, but they shouldn't kill their patients or help their patients kill themselves. And this is the reality that the euphemisms, death with dignity, assisted dying, aid in dying, those are the truths that these euphemisms seek to cover up. What they seek to cover up is the fact that a killing is taking place. It's not that you're assisting someone to die of natural causes and comforting them and easing the pain. It's that you're actively taking a life. And so what I want to suggest are 4 ways in which this plays out. First, assisted suicide endangers the weak and the marginalized in society. Where physician-assisted suicide has been allowed, the safeguards purporting to minimize this risk have proved inadequate and have often been either watered down or eliminated altogether. People most in need of society's assistance are offered instead an accelerated death. Second, physician-assisted suicide changes the culture in which medicine is practiced. It corrupts the profession of medicine by permitting the tools of healing to be used as techniques for killing. By the same token, assisted suicide threatens to distort the doctor-patient relationship because it reduces a patient's trust in his or her doctor, and it reduces the doctor's undivided commitment to the life and the health of their patient. Moreover, the option of assisted suicide creates perverse economic incentives, especially in the financing of healthcare, which, as we know, is a scarce resource. Physician-assisted suicide offers a cheap, quick fix in a world of limited financial and healthcare resources. Third, Assisted suicide harms our entire culture, but especially the family and our intergenerational obligations. There's a temptation to view the elderly or disabled family members as burdens. And legalized assisted suicide will increase this temptation, as it will increase the temptation for our elderly and sick family members to view themselves as burdens. And so assisted suicide undermines the social solidarity and true compassions which should be the hallmark of the family. Fourth, assisted suicide is a profound injustice because it violates human dignity and equality before the law. If every human being has intrinsic dignity and immeasurable worth, then for our legal system to be just, it has to respect this dignity in everyone. But classifying a subgroup of citizens as eligible to be legally killed violates a nation's commitment to equality before the law. It shows profound disrespect and a certain amount of callousness to those lives that have been judged no longer worthy of life. So then the alternative is that instead of embracing assisted suicide, we should respond to suffering with true compassion and solidarity. And so I'll close after going through those four arguments against physician-assisted suicide with a brief word about hospice care, about palliative care, about some of the alternative medical treatments to living a life of pain and suffering and isolation. Because the way that the media, particularly in the United States, particularly surrounding the Brittany Maynard situation, presented this as if the alternatives were either a life of terrible suffering and pain and loneliness and isolation or assisted suicide. And of course, this overlooks and ignores the true option here, which is solidarity, community, palliative care, and hospice care. So let me go through first, the first argument, how physician-assisted suicide particularly endangers the weak and the marginalized in society. And this argument I'll make in three different steps. So if you're taking notes or wanting to follow the architecture of this, this is the first argument against assisted suicide based on how it hurts and targets the weak and the marginalized. And within that, there'll be three sub-steps. And the first is that who's most likely to be pushed into accepting physician-assisted suicide? It's not the strong and the wealthy and the powerful. It's going to be the people at the margins of society, the weak and the lonely, the powerless, the poor, frequently racial and ethnic minorities. Those will be the ones most likely pressured into artificially killing themselves prematurely, because the cultural and economic pressures will come to bear on them the most. The New York State Task Force that Governor Mario Cuomo was the liberal Catholic who was personally opposed to abortion but publicly pro-choice. Not particularly a social conservative. He set up a task force back in the 80s to, it was 94, to investigate and explore whether or not New York State should legalize physician-assisted suicide. And the task force came back and concluded unanimously that legalizing assisted suicide would pose profound risks to many patients. Quote, "The practices will pose the greatest risks to those who are poor, elderly, members of minority groups, or without access to good medical care." They went on to say, quote, "The clinical safeguards that have been proposed to prevent abuse and errors would not be realized in many cases." And so New York State, again, one of the more liberal states in the US, did not opt to legalize physician-assisted suicide because it saw that their commitment to liberalism, and if liberalism is meant to be looking out for the weakest in our society, then they couldn't create a new institution that would target them. What the researchers find is that the people most likely to be assisted by a physician to commit suicide are suffering not from a terminal illness, but from depression or mental illness or loneliness or simply despair. Dr. Herbert Hendon and Kathleen Foley, two researchers who have been studying the psychology and psychiatry of people who commit suicide, find, quote, "Researchers have found hopelessness, which is strongly correlated with depression, to be the factor that most significantly predicts the wish for death." Dr. Hendon then concluded, mental illness raises the suicide risk even more than physical illness. Nearly 95% of those who kill themselves have been shown to have a diagnosable psychiatric illness in the months preceding suicide. The majority suffer from depression that can be treated. This is particularly true for those over 50 who are more prone than younger victims to take their lives during the type of acute depressive episode that responds most effectively to treatment. And yet, from their years of practice, they have found that most of these suicides went without adequate psychiatric care. And so instead of legalizing physician-assisted suicide, we should be increasing access to psychiatric and psychological care and removing the stigma that is sometimes attached to seeking out professional mental health. Too often there's a stigma about, oh, I'm going to see a therapist, and so people suffer alone. So let me move on to subsection 2. The legal protections that have been offered to prevent physician-assisted suicide from being abused are woefully inefficient. And so even if your main goal was to simply uphold autonomy, and you said consenting adults should do whatever consenting adults want to do, provided it's consensual, it's very similar to the argument for marriage, and you apply it to this context. And if I'm a patient who wants to kill myself and you're a doctor who wants to kill me, provided it's consensual, it should be legal. It's a certain type of libertarian argument. Even if you embraced that libertarian argument, the legal safeguards that have been enacted are woefully insufficient to protect patient autonomy. And so let me describe to you how the DC bill, which hasn't passed, but these are the protections in the DC bill, and they're modeled off of the law in Oregon, Washington, and Vermont, the 3 US states that do have assisted suicide. The DC bill says that before I could go to a physician to seek out a lethal dosage of drugs, I'd have to make 2 oral requests for the assisted suicide, separated by 2 weeks. So day 1 and day 15, I have to make the requests. And somewhere in between, I have to make a written request. And the written request has to be witnessed by 2 friends or family members who say that I'm not suffering from depression. The physician then has to verify their judgment and seek out a second opinion. So I have to make 2 requests orally, one of which also needs to be made in writing. I need to get 2 of my friends to say, yeah, I deserve to die, and I need 2 physicians to say the same. Here's the thing. I can shop around for the physicians, and in fact, the various pro-euthanasia groups in the US keep a listing of physicians who will more or less rubber stamp that I am in fact terminal. Because what they say is that you have to be in good mental condition and be suffering from a terminal disease in which you would die in 6 months. But they never define what terminal entails. Does it mean terminal without any medical treatment, or does it mean terminal with all available medical treatments? Nor does it define whether terminal has to include only physical illnesses, or could mental ailments that make life not worth living count as well. So it's rife through with arbitrary distinctions, arbitrary judgments, and it allows you as the patient to pick who will be your witnesses and who will be the physicians making these judgments. Or it allows the strongest person in your household to make those choices. So let's say I'm a 90-year-old member of a household, and it's my 50-year-old son who's taking me to see 2 physicians who will rubber stamp this, and has 2 of his friends to witness the request for my assisted suicide. Ultimately, whoever is in control gets to seek out the 2 doctors and the 2 witnesses. Once this happens, the physician prescribes the medicine, and the patient receives the lethal dosage and is sent home to self-administer the drugs. At the moment of administration of the drugs, there is no safeguard at all. So who will be in control at the moment the actual decision is made whether or not to ingest the drugs? It may be the patient, but it may also be whoever that strongest member of the household is. It could be a spouse, it could be a sibling, it could be an adult child Whoever it is has made the judgment that this life has run its course. Judge Gorsuch is a United States Circuit Court judge. He did his Ph.D. in bioethics and the law at Oxford University under John Finnis. John Finnis is a philosopher native of Adelaide, Australia, and then went to Oxford, and he teaches philosophy of law there. Gorsuch has studied these laws in the United States, and he says, quote, "How does it serve the goal of autonomous patient decision-making to set up a regime that allows people to commit suicide without considering whether they are, in fact, acting freely, competently, and autonomously at the time of suicide?" End quote. He says there's no protection at the very moment that the person's not suffering from an acute bout of depression or that they're not being coerced into it by a family member. Let me move on to the section, the third subsection within this larger category of how it most impacts the weak and the marginalized, is that we've seen this logic play out in other nations that start with physician-assisted suicide and then progress down a road towards voluntary euthanasia and then involuntary euthanasia. And here's why. While you may try to cabin your law to say, oh, it'll only be a physician prescribing a drug and then the patient administering it, it very quickly leads to active euthanasia, where the doctor actually does the killing, and then to involuntary active euthanasia, where the patient doesn't even make the request. Because the logic of compassion is that if certain lives are better off dead, why does it matter whether or not they request it? If I'm suffering and the law's made the judgment that I'm eligible for assisted suicide, if I can request it and swallow the drug myself, well, what if I'm suffering and I request it, but I can no longer swallow? Why can't the doctor simply inject me with the lethal drug? And so you see, we've gone from physician-assisted suicide to voluntary active euthanasia. The doctor, I've requested it, is now actively killing me. But now let's say I'm even more suffering. I have even greater suffering, so I can no longer even request assisted suicide. I'm in such a bad state. Why can't the doctor simply make the judgment that I would be better off dead? And as we saw this morning, so I won't go through all of the various places where this is happening, but we're seeing that play out in the Netherlands and in Belgium and in Switzerland and in other Central European countries that have started going down this road. I'm going to read one quote here just to give you the idea that this is the mainstream view and not just the view of kind of isolated social conservatives and religious right activists. In October 2013, so not even 2 years ago now, the High Court of Ireland, when they were considering suicide there, looked to the global experience and said, quote, "The incidence of legally assisted death without explicit request in the Netherlands, Belgium, and Switzerland is strikingly high," end quote. Because they looked at all of the studies, they looked at the data, and they concluded as to why they weren't going to declare a constitutional right to assisted suicide in Ireland, the experience of it violating patient autonomy in those three nations. Here is how another scholar, John Keown, he's a professor of bioethics at Georgetown University, says. He says, quote, "Once a doctor is prepared to make a judgment in the case of a patient capable of requesting death, the judgment can logically equally be made in the case of a patient incapable of requesting death. If a doctor thinks death would benefit the patient, why should the doctor deny the patient the benefit merely because the patient is incapable of asking for it? The logical slippery slope argument is unanswerable," end quote. Dr. Zeke Emanuel, the brother of Rahm Emanuel. You remember Rahm Emanuel? He was Obama's advisor who said, never let a crisis go to waste. He's now the mayor of Chicago, the major city in Illinois. This is what his brother, Zeke Emanuel, said. Zeke is a physician, a Harvard-educated physician. He was writing in The Atlantic Monthly. The Atlantic is a liberal magazine in the United States. He says, "The Netherlands shows the Netherlands demonstrates that permitting physician-assisted suicide and euthanasia will lead to non-voluntary euthanasia of children, the demented, the mentally ill, the old, and others. Indeed, the persistence of abuse and the violation of safeguards, despite publicity and condemnation, suggests that the feared consequences of legalization are exactly its inherent consequences, end quote. So here you have a liberal, the brother of a top Obama advisor, saying that these consequences are inherent. It'll lead to the non-voluntary euthanasia of disabled children, the demented elderly, the mentally ill, the old, and other marginalized people. So if you care about social justice, you have to care about whether or not your law allows physicians to kill. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip ahead to the second part rather than going through some of the horror stories. But it's easy enough to Google. You can Google either the Netherlands, Belgium, or Switzerland and type in, abuses euthanasia, abuses assisted suicide, and you will see example after example of people who should not have been killed who have been killed. But second, let me move on to how physician-assisted suicide changes the culture in which medicine is practiced. And so here again, I'm going to do this in 3 steps. So if you're taking notes, this is the second major argument, and within it will be 3 sub-arguments. And the first sub-argument is that it will corrupt the culture in which medicine is practiced by changing the profession of medicine from being one of healing to now using those tools of healing upon request to be tools of killing. The heart of medicine historically has been restoring wholeness. It's been healing a patient. But a doctor cannot heal a patient by killing a patient or helping them to kill themselves. So while doctors rightly seek to eliminate disease or to eliminate pain and suffering, they shouldn't seek to eliminate their patient. And so allowing doctors to kill fundamentally corrupts the defining goal of what medicine is all about. And as it does so, it'll change a doctor's heart, and it'll change the way they view their patients. Here's how Dr. Leon Kass, Leon Kass is a national treasure in the United States. He's an MD, Ph.D. He's that rare scientist and physician who also understands the humanities, who understands philosophy and theology and literature. And he's made his life's work the intersection of how medicine and science and the humanities intersect. And this is what he had to say when he testified before the U.S. House of Representatives. He said, quote, "The legalization of physician-assisted suicide will pervert the medical profession by transforming the healer of human beings into a technical dispenser of death. For over 2 millennia, the medical ethic, mindful that power to cure is also power to kill, has held as an inviolable rule, doctors must not kill," end quote. So his argument here is even if you're not pro-life in general, so even if you think some other third party should be allowed to kill people, you shouldn't allow doctors to kill, because it's the profession of medicine to heal, and this will corrupt that profession. Dr. Paul McHugh, the chair of psychiatry at Johns Hopkins Hospital, the most prestigious American hospital, more or less argues the same thing. He says, quote, "Since ancient Greece, physicians have been tempted to help desperate patients kill themselves, and many of those Greek doctors did so. But even then, the best rejected such actions as unworthy, and as the Hippocratic Oath insists, contrary to the physician's purpose of benefiting the sick." McHugh's highlighting that this psychological temptation to see someone suffering and therefore to eliminate the sufferer has been around since the dawn of mankind, and that's why you need a bright line rule. So it's not surprising that we see dozens and dozens, more or less every professional medical association in the United States and globally is opposed to the legalization of physician-assisted suicide. It's the American Medical Association, the American Nurses Association, the World Health Organization, just as a few examples, but also disability rights groups. the American Association of People with Disabilities, the World Association of Persons with Disabilities, the World Institute on Disability, and my favorite disability rights group, Not Dead Yet. The AMA, the American Medical Association, explicitly rejects physician-assisted suicide in its code of ethics. And it states very simply, quote, physician-assisted suicide is fundamentally incompatible with the physician's role as a healer. So let me move on to the subsection number 2 here. Physician-assisted suicide also distorts the doctor-patient relationship. So precisely because it corrupts the practice of medicine, it'll distort the relationship that each and every one of us has with our physician. Because it impacts how much trust we as patients can have in our physicians, that they will only do things to help and heal us and never do anything to hurt or kill us. And it changes the physician's heart to now be open to the possibility that, well, I might heal them, but I might judge to kill them. One of the things that bright line ethical rules do is they simply close off certain avenues. And so it's similar to the marriage debate. Once you get married and you say, I'm never cheating on my spouse, it helps you close off the door to even engaging in thought experiments with pursuing other people. You know, once you say, I'm committing to this one for life exclusively, permanently, it makes it easier to avoid the temptations of other relationships. But if you had it open as well, I'm committing for now, but maybe down the road, you would see how those temptations would be more likely to get the best of you. Same thing in medicine. If you're open to the possibility of sometimes killing your patients, over time, you'll avail yourself of that possibility more often. And it's the same exact way that I mentioned in the marriage lecture, that our laws shape our culture shapes our beliefs, and then our beliefs shape our behavior. And so if the law is teaching you that sometimes it's okay to kill, if you start believing that sometimes it's okay to kill, eventually you'll start killing sometimes. This is how the legal philosopher John Finnis, I mentioned that he had taught Judge Gorsuch, he's at Oxford, he's from Australia, don't hold it against him. This is what he had to say. He says, change the law and change the professional ethic. Killing with intent becomes a routine option. Oh yes, there are restrictions, guidelines, and paperwork. They're well meant, they're not utterly irrelevant, but they're nothing compared with the doctor's change in heart, the doctor's change in professional formation, and the doctor's conscience. End quote. Dr. Cass says the same thing. This is how he described it. He says, won't it be tempting to think that death is the best treatment for the little old lady dumped again in the emergency room by the nearby nursing home? Even the most humane and conscientious physician psychologically needs protection against himself and his weaknesses if he is to care fully for those who entrust themselves to him. A physician friend who worked many years in a hospice caring for dying patients explained it to me most convincingly. Quote, only because I knew that I would not and could not kill my patients was I able to enter most fully and intimately into caring for them as they lay dying. End quotes. Again, in the interest of time, I'll move on to just one last quote from Professor Finnis. He dramatizes a scene. He says, imagine you're a patient at a hospital, and he wants you to think, how much can you tell your physician if you don't know where your physician stands on assisted suicide? He says, quote, a new zone of silence. Can I safely speak to my physician about the full extent of my sufferings, about my fears, about my occasional wish to be free from my burdens? Will my words be heard as a plea to be killed, as tacit permission? And why does my physician even need my permission? You could see how if you were in a hospital where physician-assisted suicide had now been legalized, that thought process going through your own mind. And therefore, how much would you fully say to your physician for fear that you might be misinterpreted. Subheading number 3, it also creates perverse economic incentives. Because as we know, caring for the sick, the elderly, those towards the end of life can be very expensive. And so what might be seen as a cost-effective solution will be offering counseling to guide people towards assisted suicide. We already heard the quote from Baroness Marianne Warnock that if you're demented, you're wasting people's lives, your family's lives, and you're wasting the resources of the National Health Service. She has said there's a duty to die. We also see that Derek Humphrey, the founder of the Hemlock Society, which is the largest pro-euthanasia group in the United States, it subsequently changed its name to Compassion and Choices. They thought Compassion and Choices sounds better than Hemlock Society. He said that there's a connection between the right to die and the cost, value, and allocation of healthcare. And he said, quote, "It's impossible to predict exactly how much money could be saved. Conservative estimates, however, place the dollar amount in the tens of billions." And so it's not surprising that we've seen in the state of Oregon, people who were on government health care were sent letters saying, we can't afford to cover your chemotherapy, but we can cover your assisted suicide. The economic pincer move of encouraging people. Which leads to the third major heading, how it will harm our entire culture, especially our families and our intergenerational commitments. And here, this will just be in 2 headings, if you're taking notes. The basic idea here is that there's always a temptation to view other people's as burdens rather than as blessings. In any stage of life, there's always that temptation to look upon other people as burdens and to do a quick fix solution. Having the legal option for physician-assisted suicide will only exacerbate that temptation. For me to look at my elderly parents as burdens, for my elderly parents to view themselves as burdens, for them to come to see that the most loving thing to do would just be to off themselves so that they wouldn't burden their children and grandchildren. But a proper understanding of the family sees that we have responsibility for our loved ones. We have duties to our elderly and disabled family members. That there's a natural cycle to human life. You know, as children, we enter the world entirely needy, totally dependent on other people. And many of us will exit life in that similar condition, needy, dependent on other people. There's something perverse about 21st century human life in which we view being needy as being bad, that we should all be autonomous, self-sufficient adults who never need to rely on our neighbors, our friends, or our families. It's the myth of that autonomy and self-sufficiency that so often leads people to be afraid to ask for help in any state of life, but it's particularly becoming a problem at the end of life. So traditionally, the family has been the central social institution for weathering life's storms. Mothers and fathers take care of children at the dawn of life, and then children take care of their aging parents at the twilight of life. Family life is meant to shoulder each other's burdens. There's an ethicist, he's a Lutheran theologian, Gilbert Meilander. He's an American, German Lutheran thinker. He wrote an essay about 20 years ago that I've always appreciated, partly just for its title. The title is, quote, "I want to burden my loved ones." And he was writing this, he was middle-aged at the time, he's now become a little bit more elderly. He says, as I age, I want to burden my children and my brothers and sisters, because that's part of the human experience. They will become better people by me burdening them, just as I became a better person when they burdened me. You know, his experience as a father was that having children was a burden. It required work and sacrifice, and sacrificial love actually shaped him into a better person. So in a similar way, he was saying, somewhat tongue-in-cheek, but also somewhat to make a real point, that when he exits life, he wants to burden his family precisely so that they have those opportunities for self-sacrificial love. That the idea of everything being too neat and clean actually dehumanizes these opportunities for sacrifice. Let me say one more thing about, so this is the second subheading, about how this plays out, particularly for those who are disabled or elderly. Because all of a sudden now, we will have that temptation to view ourselves as burdening others in the bad way. Oh, I don't want to be a burden on my children. I don't want to be a burden on my family. Professor Finnis also gives us a dramatic vision of this. He says, quote, "Another zone of fearful silence. Outside the door are the relatives. What will they be telling the doctor about my condition and my wishes? What is prudent for me to tell them about my suffering, my depression, my hopes and fears? Are they interpreting my state of mind just as I would wish? Are their interests in line with mine?" And you can see how he's highlighting that allowing physician-assisted suicide opens up that door to the children's interests being out of whack with their elderly parents' wishes, and therefore not being able to trust your own children for fear of what might happen. Victoria Kennedy is the widow of Senator Ted Kennedy, the liberal senator from Massachusetts. When Massachusetts in 2012 was considering legalizing physician-assisted suicide, she was one of the spokespeople against it. And this is what she said. She says, quote, "The proposed law is not about bringing family together to make end-of-life decisions. It's intended to exclude family members from the actual decision-making process, to guard against patients being pressured to end their lives prematurely." This is how she described her husband, who died of cancer. He says, quote, "When my husband was first diagnosed with cancer, he was told he only had 2 to 4 months to live and that he'd never go back to the US Senate, that he should get his affairs in order, kiss his wife, and get ready to die. But that prognosis was wrong. Teddy lived 15 more productive months. Because the first dire prediction of life expectancy was wrong, I have 15 months of cherished memories. Memories of family dinners and song fests with our children and grandchildren. Memories of laughter and, yes, tears. Memories of life that neither I nor my husband would have traded for anything in the world. When the end finally did come, natural death with dignity, my husband was home, attended by his doctor, surrounded by family, and our priest." Isn't that what a death with dignity actually looks like? And what Senator Ted Kennedy's widow was arguing for Massachusetts was that she wanted more families to have what her family had, and that if they changed the law in Massachusetts, fewer families would, and more families would be pressured into the quick, cheap, and easy solution. There's an example that I cite in the paper from, again, Dr. Hendon, and he points out, he's telling the stories of how family members have coerced each other into this, with the physicians knowing about it, but turning a blind eye. He says, quote, "A wife no longer wished to care for her sick, elderly husband, gave him a choice between euthanasia and admission to a home for the chronically ill. The man, afraid of being left to the mercy of strangers in an unfamiliar place, chose to have his life ended. The doctor, although aware of the coercion, ended the man's life." These stories are not isolated incidents. A study of Dutch hospitals found that, quote, "Doctors and nurses reported that more requests for euthanasia came from families than from patients themselves. The investigator concluded that the families, the doctors, and the nurses were involved in pressuring patients to request euthanasia." And as we already mentioned, there's the social contagion phenomenon. This morning's lecture helpfully highlighted that. So I have 4 minutes left to go to the fourth argument against this. And this will also be in 3 parts. And the basic idea here is that physician-assisted suicide is a profound injustice because it violates human dignity and denies equality before the law. So you've noticed that the three arguments I made so far haven't even touched on the question of whether it's moral or immoral. The first three arguments I made were just about how it impacts a society, how it targets the weak and the marginalized, how it corrupts medicine, how it distorts the family. It's only now in this fourth stage that I'll make the direct moral argument that physician-assisted suicide is immoral because it violates human dignity. And so the first sub-argument here is that every human being has intrinsic dignity and worth. In the U.S. Declaration of Independence, we say that all men are created equal and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The philosophers Robert P. George and Patrick Lee explain that, quote, every human being of whatever age, size, or degree of development has inherent and equal dignity and rights. This dignity is not based on subjective evaluations of worth, not even self-worth, not based on our ability to contribute to society. Rather, this dignity is intrinsic. Human dignity is not based on an instrumental account of what a person can do, but on a recognition of what a person is. A person made with free will in the image and likeness of God. And it's that imago Dei that ultimately grounds the innate, inestimable worth of each and every human person. This isn't just something that the U.S. Declaration of Independence points out, but the UN Declaration of Human Rights starts by noting the recognition of the inherent dignity and the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace. The European Convention on Human Rights also emphasizes this, quote, everyone's right to life shall be protected by law. This right is one of the most important of the convention, since without the right to life, it's impossible to enjoy other rights. So let me move on to subhead 2. Therefore, the law must respect human dignity and equality. But any law that authorizes physician-assisted suicide states that some lives are unworthy of the law's protections, that some lives are lives unworthy of life. There's no way around it. However you define who is eligible for assisted suicide or euthanasia, you're saying that those people don't deserve the equal protection of the law. And this is why I said that one of my favorite groups is the Not Dead Yet group, because they point out that this is a profound injustice to the disabled. People who are disabled but not dead are being told by the law that their lives don't deserve the same protections. As a relatively healthy young person, if I had suicidal thoughts, the government could forcibly detain me. The government could say, because you're suicidal, because you're depressed, we're going to lock you up in a psychiatric facility to make sure you don't harm yourself. If I was disabled and I had suicidal thoughts, and I lived in one of these nations that had legalized assisted suicide for the disabled, the government wouldn't provide me those protections. The government would assist me with a lethal dosage of drugs. And so in this way, the disability rights groups say this is a profound injustice, a violation of human dignity. I'm now out of time, so I'll just skip to the conclusion, and we can talk more about this during the Q&A, especially since we have two actual physicians with us. I'm the philosopher Ph.D. I believe the other two doctors are MDs. So I'll just say that there is an alternative here. The alternative is not to say that you're going to be left alone without medical care. The alternative here is to provide people true compassion, solidarity, medical treatment that can treat the symptoms of pain. That's part of what palliative care and hospice care do. It's very rare, if not never, in which someone has to die either alone or in pain. That, we now have the technology to treat most symptoms of pain with morphine, with other comfort care, and we are now a resource-rich enough society that we can always have that human presence. In the United States, we have a group, the Little Sisters of the Poor, who you probably know because they're suing the Obama administration over the Obamacare law because he's making them pay for abortion, but they're dedicated to helping people face death with dignity by approaching a natural death surrounded by love and support and care. And that's ultimately what we owe everyone. Thank you.